The silver goblet was shaking in Celeste's hands. At the far end of the ceremonial table, Alpha King Lucian rose to his full height, armor catching torchlight as he leaned forward to sign the oath that would bind his pack to the Northern Territory forever. Around them, the great hall held its breath. Advisors, warriors, and servants lined the walls in rigid submission. Celeste's gaze dropped to the parchment she had copied herself. One line snagged like a claw. By moon and blood, all that is mine becomes thine. All that breathes beneath my shadow bows to thy command. She'd seen those words before. On the contract that had enslaved her father and worked him to death in Thorn's mines. Lucian's scarred fingers brushed the signature line. Every instinct screamed at Celeste to stay silent. Omegas didn't speak unless spoken to. Omegas who challenged Alphas died, but she stepped forward anyway. "Excuse me, Alpha." Her voice cut through the silence. "But this oath is a trap." The hall detonated into shocked stillness. Lucian's head turned slowly toward her. His eyes bled from brown to gold to wolf dark, the color of dominance and promised violence. "Repeat that," he said softly, carefully. The sacred grove had never known silence like this. Moonlight spilled through the ancient branches, silvering the stone altar, the kneeling nobles, the rows of warriors bowing their heads in practiced reverence. The air still thrummed with the last echo of High Counselor Thorn's voice as he finished reciting the binding oath, his hand outstretched toward the Alpha King. "All that breathes under my protection bows to thy command," he'd said. The final clause that would fuse two of the largest packs on the continent and cement Lucian's power for a generation. Every wolf in the clearing had their head lowered. Every wolf except one. Celeste's lungs burned. Her heart hammered so hard she thought the entire grove must hear it, must smell the terror rolling off her in waves. Omega, lowest rank, background shadow. She was supposed to be invisible, especially tonight. Catalog the old treaties, stand at the edge with the other servants, and pretend she didn't exist. Instead, she heard her own voice, thin but unmistakable, cut through the ritual hush. "Your Majesty." The sacred words weren't hers to speak. The interruption shattered the rhythm of the ceremony like a stone through glass. Chanting ceased. Wolves froze mid-breath. Hundreds of heads snapped toward her at once, and the weight of their shock nearly sent her to her knees. High Counselor Marcus recovered first. His eyes narrowed, pale and cold, pinning her where she stood at the tree line. "Who dares?" Power rolled over the grove like a storm front breaking. It was not Marcus. It was Lucian. The Alpha King straightened on the stone dais, the ceremonial black and silver of his cloak, falling in perfect lines over armor that gleamed like obsidian. Power pulsed from him in an invisible wave, a force that drove every wolf's gaze downward, spines bending in involuntary submission. Celeste felt it crash into her raw dominance, the instinctive command of a king who had never been disobeyed. Her knees buckled. The grove dimmed at the edges of her vision. Every cell in her body screamed at her to bow, to put her face in the moss and stay silent, to live. But over the roar of instinct came another sound, her father's voice. Rough from chains and smoke, whispering the words of the claws that had ruined him. "All that breathes under my protection bows to thy command." Those were the last words he'd spoken before his bond devoured him, before his Alpha had signed away every wolf under his protection to a man just like Thorn. Celeste sucked in a breath that felt like broken glass. She forced her spine straight. Lucian's power pressed harder, like a hand at the back of her neck. Her muscles trembled. Sweat slid down her spine beneath her simple gray dress. The edges of her vision bled to white, but she did not bend. Slowly, the Alpha King turned his head and truly looked at her. She felt it like a physical touch, the full focus of eyes, the color of old steel, sharp and impossible to read. The fury, there was a living thing. She had broken sacred protocol in his grove, during his oath ceremony, in front of every allied Alpha on the continent. And Omega had interrupted a king. The grove held its breath. High Counselor Marcus snapped first, stepping forward so fast his ceremonial robes snapped around his ankles. His power, weaker than Lucian's but still considerable, flared scarlet at the edges. "This is blasphemy," he hissed. "An Omega dares disrupt the binding? Drag her out. We will deal with—" Lucian lifted one hand. Silence slammed down again. Marcus's mouth clicked shut mid-word, his fury checked by a single unhurried gesture from the king. Even enraged, Lucian moved with the controlled calm of a predator who knew he could end every life in the glade if he wished. He studied Celeste for one long, measuring beat. "Explain yourself," he said, his voice low and carrying, power threaded through every syllable. Omega. The title was not kind. It reminded everyone present of exactly what she was. Celeste swallowed. Her tongue felt like ashes. Every survival instinct she possessed shrieked at her to apologize, drop to her knees, claim madness, anything to escape the full burn of that gaze. But then Marcus shifted, and she saw the parchment in his hand. The oath still open, the ink not yet fully dry. Thorn stood beside him, lips curved in the satisfied smile of a man about to win far more than he should. If they finished it, if Lucian spoke the last words, "Every wolf that breathes under my protection." Her father's face flashed in her mind again, the stink of silver, the sound of a pack howling as they realized their alpha had traded their freedom for a promise of glory. Celeste drew in a shaking breath. "The claws," she said. Her voice came out hoarse, too soft. She forced it louder. "The final line of the oath, Your Majesty. It is not what you think." A ripple went through the gathered wolves, half shock, half outrage. No one dissected sacred language in the grove. The oaths were older than any of them, carved in stone and tradition. Marcus's lip curled. "You dare question the binding? You know nothing of—" "I know what it cost my father," she blurted, eyes snapping to him before she could stop herself. His face whitened. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his features. "You shouldn't have said that," a terrified part of her hissed. "Now he knows you know." Lucian's gaze sharpened. "Continue," he ordered. Celeste's fingers dug into the worn leather strap of the satchel at her side. It still hung from her shoulder, absurdly ordinary amid the pageantry and power, a clerk's bag full of cracked bindings and dust. "I was cataloging the old treaties in the palace archives," she said. Each word a struggle past the weight of Lucian's presence, preparing the histories for this ceremony. There were bond documents from the Eastern Range 30 years ago. My father's pack. She saw, in the corner of her eye, Thorn's shoulders stiffen. "The bond that enslaved them to Lord Halvar," Celeste continued, throat tight. "The one the council declared a tragic misinterpretation. Our investigation found no evidence of fraud," Marcus snapped. "Your father's alpha signed willingly. His failure is not the king's concern." "It is tonight," Celeste said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Because the clause in his contract and the clause in your oath are the same." That sent a true shockwave through the grove. Lucian's expression didn't change, but something about the air around him did. The power pressing on Celeste's shoulders shifted from pure rage to something colder. "Calculating. Speak plainly," he said. Celeste swallowed. Her knees were shaking now. She curled her toes in her boots, anchoring herself to the moss. "The phrasing," she said. "All that breathes under my protection bows to thy command." In Lord Halvar's contract, those words did not mean alliance, Your Majesty. They meant ownership. Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "Every wolf bound to my father's alpha, their land, their labor, their children became Halvar's property. They were inventory, for trade, for debt." Murmurs erupted, disbelieving, horrified. Thorn's face darkened an ugly, blotched red. "Lies," he spat. "Ancient nonsense. The girl misread some crumbling scrap, and now dares slander the High Council in the king's sacred grove." Celeste yanked at the buckle of her satchel with fumbling fingers. "I brought it." The strap slipped, the leather bag thudding against her hip. Her hands dove inside, pushing past carefully bundled scrolls and cracked bindings until her fingers closed around the stiff, familiar parchment that had been haunting her dreams for a week. She pulled it free and held it up with both hands, arms trembling. The seals were broken, the ink was faded, but the lines were clear. Lucian extended his hand without looking at Marcus or Thorn. "Bring it." Celeste froze. Gabriel moved instead. The king's beta stepped down from the dais, cutting through the bewildered crowd with the easy authority of a wolf accustomed to obedience. He was taller up close than she'd realized, dark hair bound at the nape, the faintest hint of a scar along his jaw. His eyes, unlike Lucian's iron, were a deep, assessing brown that swept over her quickly, taking in the shaking hands, the cheap fabric of her dress, the satchel. He didn't sneer. He didn't soften either. "Give it to me," he said quietly. Her fingers brushed his glove as he took the parchment. For a heartbeat, she felt something she couldn't name. Pity, maybe, or warning. Then he turned and carried the ancient bond up to the king. Lucian took it and unrolled it with practiced economy of motion. The grove was so silent Celeste could hear the faint crackle of old fibers yielding after decades rolled tight. His gaze flicked across the contract once, twice. The muscles in his jaw flexed. "Marcus," he said, voice calm, too calm. "Recite the final clause of the oath you placed before me." Marcus hesitated. That alone sent a chill through the assembly. He cleared his throat. "All that breathes under my protection bows to thy command. For as long as moon and blood endure." Lucian's eyes dropped back to the Eastern Range contract. His thumb traced one line, the faded script under his touch. "Identical," he said softly. No one breathed. Thorne exploded. "This is madness!" he roared, his cultivated composure shredding. Power flared around him, hot and red, snarling against Lucian's cool control. An obsolete bond from a failed alpha proves nothing. Language evolves. You know this. We vetted every clause. "You vetted them," Lucian corrected, eyes lifting to fix on him. "Steel, now. No calculation, no fury, death, for your purposes." Thorne opened his mouth, but Lucian spoke over him. "Legal scholars," he called, voice cutting through the rising chaos like a blade. "Step forward." Robes rustled. The king's lawmasters, gray-haired wolves with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes, pushed their way out of the crowd. One by one, they came to the dais, bowing briefly before Lucian handed the old contract to the nearest. "Compare this bond to the oath set before me tonight," he ordered. "Clause by clause. Meaning, not just words. I want a ruling before sunset tomorrow." The masters exchanged uneasy glances. "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. So is discovering that the High Council may have attempted to transfer ownership of my pack," Lucian said, his voice soft and lethal. "You have until sunset." No one argued again. "The binding is suspended," Lucian announced, projecting his voice across the grove. Gasps rippled through the crowd. An entire season of political maneuvering, of alliances and threats and quiet promises, halted on the word of an Omega and the king's decision to listen. Lucian turned, gaze slicing back to her. For one dizzying second, Celeste thought he might order her dragged away and executed anyway. Exposing a council plot did not always save the messenger, especially when the messenger was expendable. Instead, he nodded once to Gabriel. "Escort her to the palace," he said. "She is not to leave my grounds. No one speaks to her without my permission." Marcus started forward, outrage blazing. "Your Majesty, she has accused the council of fraud. This is treason. Interrupting the binding is a death sentence. We must make an example." Lucian didn't even look at him. "If she is wrong," he said, "I will." The simple promise sent ice down Celeste's spine. "If she is right," he let the unfinished sentence hang in the charged air, "you would be wise to consider which examples I choose to make first." Color drained from Marcus's face. The assembly dissolved into chaos. Alphas conferred in urgent whispers. Warriors herded confused Omegas toward the path. The grove that had felt like a temple minutes ago now buzzed like a disturbed hive, fear and speculation crackling in every look. Celeste stood frozen, parchmentless, and suddenly very, very aware of the danger she'd stepped into. The insistent roar of her pulse drowned out the noise. A hand closed around her elbow, firm but not cruel. "Gabriel, come," he said. "You heard the king." Her legs didn't want to move. The moss felt like it was swallowing her feet. "Am I?" Her voice came out a rasp. She swallowed. "Am I under arrest?" "In a manner of speaking," he said, guiding her through the parting crowd. Wolves stared at her as she passed shock, contempt, grudging respect, naked curiosity. "You disrupted a sacred ceremony and accused a high counselor of treachery. The moon alone knows why you're still breathing." "That's not comforting," she managed. His mouth twitched, almost like he wanted to smile but thought better of it. "It wasn't meant to be. Keep your head down. Don't speak to anyone. You've drawn more blood than you realize tonight, little Omega." They cleared the grove and entered the stone path that wound toward the palace. The night air felt colder away from the crush of bodies, the stars sharp above the tree line. Celeste risked a glance back. Lucian still stood on the dais, cloak dark against the pale stone, watching the dispersing crowd with the stillness of a predator deciding which throat to take first. For a heartbeat, his gaze flicked up and met hers across the distance. There was nothing soft in it. No gratitude. No anger now, either. Just the weight of a king who had been told someone tried to steal his kingdom. Gabriel's hand tightened on her arm, drawing her attention forward again. "The king will see you at dawn," he said quietly. "Between now and then, pray to the moon your accusation is truth." He opened the palace gate and guided her through, the iron bars closing behind them with a final, echoing clang. "Because if it isn't," he finished, "dawn will be the last thing you ever see." Celeste spent the night in a small chamber near the palace archives, sleepless and shaking, watching moonlight crawl across unfamiliar walls. Every sound made her flinch. Every footstep in the corridor outside sent her heart racing with the certainty that Marcus had convinced Lucian to execute her before the scholars could finish their work. But when the knock finally came, it was Gabriel's voice, calm and professional. "The king will see you now." She followed him through corridors she'd only glimpsed from the shadows during her months cataloging treaties. The palace was different at dawn, quiet, stripped of ceremony, revealing the ancient stone beneath all the pageantry. They climbed a narrow staircase and stopped before heavy oak doors carved with moon symbols. Gabriel opened them without knocking. The private study was smaller than she'd imagined, lined floor to ceiling with books and scrolls, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the season. And there, at a work table covered in parchments, sat the Alpha King. Celeste's breath caught. He'd shed the ceremonial armor, the silver cloak, all the trappings of office. Simple dark clothing, now black shirt unlaced at the throat, sleeves rolled to his forearms. His hair, no longer bound by the crown, fell loose around his shoulders in waves the color of storm clouds. Somehow, without the pageantry, he looked more dangerous, more real. A warrior king instead of a symbol. He didn't look up as Gabriel closed the door behind her, leaving them alone. "Sit," Lucian said, his voice quiet in the firelit space. There was a chair across from him. Celeste approached it like she was walking toward a cliff edge, hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. She sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap to hide the trembling. Lucian set down his pen and finally looked at her. The full weight of his attention was different here, without an audience, without protocol. His eyes, still that impossible steel gray, studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Not threatening exactly. Assessing, like he was solving a puzzle he hadn't realized existed until she'd appeared. "Tell me everything about your father," he said. Not an order, a request. The difference was subtle, but present. Celeste swallowed. His name was Corvin. He was a craftsman, woodwork, mostly. Omega. Skilled enough that Lord Halvar's recruiters offered him a position in the Eastern Range. Good wages, protection for his family. The contract seemed generous. Her voice steadied as she spoke, the story one she'd carried in silence for years. He signed, we moved. And 3 days later, Halvar's beta came to our home and told us the truth. My father didn't own his labor anymore. He owned nothing. The clause in the contract, all that breathes under my protection, meant every wolf bound to his old alpha, including my father, became Halvar's property. Lucian's expression didn't change, but his fingers stilled on the parchment. They sent him to the mines. Celeste continued, her throat tight. Silver mines. He wasn't allowed to see us except once a month. Couldn't leave. Couldn't break contract without execution. The pack healers said the silver poisoning would kill him slowly, but Halvar didn't care. Omegas were replaceable. She forced the words out past the knot in her chest. He lasted 7 years. He died when I was 15. The fire crackled. Outside, birds began their morning song, oblivious. Why didn't you speak before? Lucian asked quietly. Celeste looked down at her hands. I'm an Omega, Your Majesty. We're taught from birth to be invisible, to never challenge alphas, to accept our place. Her fingers twisted together. Speaking costs us everything, always. Then why speak now? She heard something different in his voice this time. Not demand. Genuine question. Celeste looked up and met his eyes, even though her instincts screamed at her to drop her gaze. Because I've watched you for 3 years, she admitted, while cataloging in the archives. You're not like other alphas. You listen to your betas. You protect the weak. You question unfair laws. She paused, heart hammering. You deserve to know the truth, even if it cost me my life to tell you. Something flickered in those steel eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Lucian stood and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back as he looked out over the waking kingdom. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, I'm assigning you to review every treaty I've signed in the past decade. You'll have full access to the royal archives and council records. Effective immediately. You are royal legal advisor. Celeste's mouth fell open. Your Majesty, The council will be furious, he continued, turning back to face her. Marcus will demand your dismissal. Thorn will call it madness. You'll have enemies in every corner of this palace. His gaze held hers. But I need someone I can trust, someone who sees what others miss, someone with courage. I'm just an Omega, she whispered. You interrupted a king in sacred ceremony to save his kingdom. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile but close. That's not just anything. He gestured toward the door, dismissing her. Celeste stood on shaking legs and turned to leave. Celeste. She stopped, hand on the door. That took courage, Lucian said softly. More than most alphas possess. Don't forget that when they try to make you invisible again. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled before the tears could fall. The Omega wing fell silent the day Celeste's belongings were packed. Mira's eyes went wide when she heard the destination. The West Corridor? That's for scholars and betas. The King's orders, Celeste said quietly. Old hand limped closer, voice dropping to a whisper. Omegas who climb too high don't just fall, little wolf. They're pushed. When the Beta Guard arrived calling her advisor instead of girl, no one embraced her. Only Mira brushed their wrists together as she passed a silent warning wrapped in affection. Her new quarters felt like a dream. A real bed with a wool mattress. A window. A desk with its own lamp. She stood in the doorway, trunk at her feet, whispering to herself, "This is temporary. For the work." The royal archive stretched 3 sides of a vaulted hall, shelves packed with treaties sealed in wax and leather. Gabriel met her that first morning, exhaustion shadowing his eyes. "The last 10 years of major bonds," he said, gesturing to stacks of parchment. "His Majesty wants them reviewed for traps." There were hundreds. Days blurred into ink-stained fingers and cramped shoulders. She rose before dawn, worked until her vision swam, forgetting meals until dizziness forced her to stop. Patterns emerged quickly, buried clauses about temporary stewardship with no end dates, collective benefit, language that funneled profits to single parties. Marcus's precise script appeared on every suspicious document. So did Thorn's thorn-crowned seal. By week's end, she'd found 10 fraudulent bonds. By week 2, 23, she was still working when twilight thickened the shadows. "You're still here." Lucian's voice made her jerk upright. He stood in the doorway, hair unbound, wearing simple dark clothes instead of armor. Somehow that made him more dangerous. "I was comparing eminent domain clauses," she said. His gaze swept the chaos of her workspace before returning to her face. "Have you eaten?" "This morning. It's past moonrise." He set a covered tray on the table. Steam escaped when he lifted the lid, rich with roasted meat and herbs. "Starving my only advisor seems counterproductive." "Eat. Then show me what you've found." That became their rhythm. By day, she worked alone. By night, Lucian joined her, asking sharp questions that cut to the heart of each clause. He brought food when she forgot. She discovered he read poetry. He told her about his sister who died in childbirth while he was at war. "I came home to a palace that smelled of grief," he said quietly one night. It seemed safer not to love anyone that deeply again. She shared her father's story, how his laugh had filled their small house before the fraudulent bond stole everything. The intimacy grew in small moments. Accidental touches when passing scrolls, lingering glances, the comfortable way his scent wrapped around her during those long midnights. By the 4th week, they'd cataloged 47 fraudulent bonds spanning 20 years. Hundreds of Omegas enslaved through carefully disguised legal language. "It's not carelessness," Celeste whispered, staring at the web of connections she'd mapped. "It's a system." Lucian's jaw tightened. "Built under my rule." "You're cutting it out now," she said. "That matters." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither dared speak aloud. The palace noticed everything. One afternoon, when Lucian was at the training yard, Celeste worked alone in the archive. The air suddenly thickened alpha presence, flooding the room like winter frost. High Counselor Marcus stood in the doorway, silver hair gleaming, expression cold. Omega. We should speak. Every instinct screamed submission. She set down her quill carefully. Counselor. He approached with measured steps. You've been very busy. Questioning decades of carefully negotiated peace. Some of these bonds enslave your own people, she said before fear could stop her. His eyes went flat. When he spoke again, his voice changed, threaded with command that sank hooks into her mind. You will tell the king you were mistaken. You misread the documents. You let grief cloud your judgment. You will apologize and return to your proper place. Do you understand? The compulsion slammed into her like a physical blow. Her muscles locked, her lungs seized. The overwhelming need to obey drowned every thought. Her knees buckled. The room grayed at the edges. Then another presence surged hotter, heavier, familiar as thunder. Marcus. Lucian's voice shattered the command like glass. Celeste gasped, collapsing against the table as air rushed back into her lungs. The king strode through the doors, power rolling off him in waves that made the lamps flicker. What? He said, voice lethal and soft. Are you doing to my advisor? He stepped between them, a living barrier. Marcus smoothed his expression. I was merely correcting an overstep. You used command on her. Each word rang with barely leashed fury. In my archive, without my leave, the realm's stability. Touch her mind again, Lucian growled, and I will rip your throat out and let the council argue about whether you deserved it. Shock flashed across Marcus's face, not at the threat, but at its target. A lowly Omega, defended like precious treasure. He inclined his head stiffly. As you wish, Your Majesty. I hope you remember that wolves who forget the natural order drag their packs down with them. Marcus swept out, robes whispering warnings. Silence fell, broken only by Celeste's ragged breathing. Are you hurt? Lucian asked, voice gentling. He tried to make me recant everything. Her hands shook. I was going to obey. You were compelled. There's no shame in that. His eyes blazed gold. But I will not let anyone use your designation as a weapon, not in my court. He reached out, fingers brushing hers light as a question, warm as a promise. If anyone wants to speak to you, they go through me first. Yes, she whispered. Lucian. His pupils dilated at his name on her tongue. For one charged heartbeat, the air between them crackled with something that had nothing to do with treaties. Then he stepped back. Rest. Tomorrow we catalog every bond Marcus ever touched. She watched him leave, power still humming in his wake. Han had warned her that Omegas who climb too high were pushed, but Celeste was no longer climbing alone. The harvest moon hung heavy and red over the great hall, casting everything in shades of blood and gold. Celeste moved between the long tables with practiced silence, her bare feet soundless on the cold stone floor, the wine pitcher heavy in her trembling hands. Protocol was absolute Omegas, must serve the Alphas, before they could take even a morsel for themselves. It had always been this way, written into law as old as the moon itself. She kept her eyes lowered as she poured for Lord Aldrich, then Lady Sarah, then the visiting Alphas from the northern territories. Each cup filled with the same deep crimson wine, each Alpha barely acknowledging her existence. She was a ghost moving through their celebration, invisible until needed. But when she reached Lucian's place at the head table, her hand shook. The pitcher trembled, wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his cup. She felt Marcus's eyes on her from across the hall, felt the weight of his gaze like a blade pressed to her throat. He smiled at her, cold and knowing, and she understood with sudden, horrifying clarity that something was wrong. Lucian noticed. Of course he noticed he'd been watching her all evening, tracking her movements through the crowded hall with the instinct of a predator who'd learned to recognize fear. His eyes narrowed as she glanced toward Marcus, then back at the wine pitcher, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. Years of combat had taught him to trust his instincts. The same instincts that had kept him alive through border wars and assassination attempts now screamed a warning he couldn't ignore. As Celeste set the pitcher down and stepped back, Lucian's hand moved with casual grace, switching his cup with hers. The small clay vessel Omegas were permitted to use after service was complete. He lifted the ornate goblet that had been meant for him and drank deeply, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. The poison hit his throat like liquid fire. He tasted it immediately, nightshade and silver dust, a combination that would stop an Omega's heart in seconds. His own alpha constitution could withstand it, but just barely. Pain lanced through his chest as his body fought to purge the toxin, his healing factor working frantically to neutralize what would have been a death sentence for anyone weaker. The goblet slipped from his fingers and shattered on the stone floor. The hall erupted. Alphas surged to their feet, chairs crashing backward. Celeste screamed his name, her hands reaching for him as he collapsed to one knee, his skin burning with fever as the poison warred with his supernatural healing. Guards poured in from every entrance, surrounding the high table with weapons drawn. "The wine," Lucian managed, his voice a raw growl. "Check the wine." They seized the wine steward within moments, dragging the terrified man before the assembled court. It took less than a minute of interrogation, one look at the king's silver eyes blazing with barely controlled rage before he broke completely. "Lord Marcus," the steward sobbed, falling to his knees. Lord Marcus ordered it. "The poison was meant for the Omega girl, not you, your majesty." He said she needed to learn her place. He said, "Enough." Lucian rose to his full height, the poison already purging from his system, leaving him weak but alive. His gaze found Marcus, who'd gone pale as death. "Seize him. He'll answer for this in the morning." Guards hauled Marcus away, his protests echoing through the hall. But Lucian had already turned to Celeste, who stood frozen, her face white with shock, trembling like a leaf in a storm. He crossed to her in 2 strides and lifted her into his arms, ignoring the gasps from the assembled nobles. "Clear the hall," he commanded, his voice absolute. "Everyone out. Now." They obeyed. They always obeyed. He carried her through the empty corridors to his private chambers, dismissing the healers who tried to follow. She needed safety more than medicine, needed sanctuary from the horror of what Marcus had tried to do. When he set her on the edge of his massive bed, her composure finally shattered. "I brought this on you," she sobbed, her whole body shaking. "I should leave. I should go before anyone else gets hurt because of me. Because I'm..." "Stop." He knelt before her, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You saved my pack. You saved me from a fate worse than poison, a life bound to someone who would have destroyed everything I've built. I won't let them hurt you. Not Marcus. Not anyone." The vulnerability in his voice undid something inside her, some last wall she'd been holding against him. "I'm just an Omega," she whispered. "You're everything." He kissed her then, and it broke every law of their society. His lips were gentle against hers, reverent, worshipping rather than claiming. Her hands found his shoulders, clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. When they finally parted, his eyes were still wolf-dark, but with desire now instead of dominance. Everything had changed. They both felt it, the shift between them, irreversible and absolute. Outside, the harvest moon burned red as blood, and somewhere in the dungeons below, Marcus screamed his rage at the bars of his cell. But here, in the king's private sanctuary, an Omega and an Alpha held each other in defiance of every rule that said they shouldn't exist together. And neither of them cared anymore. Gabriel worked through the night. Parchments and ledgers spread across the war room table like accusations waiting to be voiced. The investigation into Marcus had become an obsession, each uncovered thread leading to darker revelations. When he found the pattern in the financial records, he stared at the numbers for a full minute before he understood what they meant. 20 years of payments, regular, substantial amounts flowing from Marcus's estate to a small cottage on the edge of the Omega district. The same cottage where Celeste had grown up. The same cottage where her mother still lived. Lucian's face had gone cold as stone when Gabriel showed him the evidence. "Bring her here," he'd commanded, his voice devoid of inflection. Now. They dragged Celeste's mother into the throne room at dawn, and Celeste knew immediately that something was wrong. Her mother wouldn't meet her eyes, her shoulders hunched in a way that spoke of guilt rather than fear. Lucian sat on his throne like a judge from the old stories, terrible and absolute, while Gabriel laid out the financial records with methodical precision. 20 years, Gabriel said quietly. 20 years of payments, starting 3 months after Celeste's father was enslaved to Marcus. "Would you care to explain why Lord Marcus has been funding your household, madam?" Her mother's face crumpled. Celeste felt her own heart begin to crack, sensing the truth before it was spoken, knowing it would destroy something fundamental inside her. "He paid me," her mother whispered, and each word fell like a stone into dark water. "He paid me to stay silent about the bond, about what he'd done to my mate." The throne room seemed to tilt. Celeste gripped the back of a chair to keep from falling. "You knew?" Her voice came out broken, barely audible. "All this time, you knew the bond was fraudulent? He said if I spoke up, they'd kill you." Her mother finally looked at her, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You were just a baby. I had no choice, Celeste. I had to keep you safe." "Safe?" The word came out like a sob. "You let father die, believing no one cared. You let him spend 20 years enslaved to the man who destroyed him, and you took money for your silence." "I had no choice. There's always a choice." Lucian's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You chose survival over honor. You chose silver over your mate's freedom. Guards, remove her from my sight before I forget she's Celeste's kin." They hauled her away, still weeping, still making excuses that echoed off the stone walls until distance finally swallowed them. Celeste stood frozen in the center of the throne room, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to process the magnitude of her mother's betrayal. Lucian dismissed the court with a gesture, and suddenly they were alone in the vast space, just an Omega and a king, and the wreckage of everything she'd believed about her family. She fled before he could speak, before anyone could see her break completely. He found her hours later on the palace ramparts, standing at the edge where the wind whipped her hair around her face like silver flames. The stars burned cold overhead, indifferent to human suffering, and she stared up at them as if searching for answers they couldn't provide. "She chose survival over honor," Celeste whispered when she heard his footsteps approach. She didn't turn around. 20 years of silence bought with blood money. And I'm no different, am I? I stayed silent for 3 years while Marcus paraded his false bond before the whole kingdom. I'm just like her. No. Lucian's voice was firm, absolute. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth cutting through the night's chill. You were powerless then. A child trapped in a system designed to crush you. But you're not powerless anymore, aren't I? She finally looked at him, and the devastation in her eyes made his chest ache. I'm still just an Omega, still one word away from being discarded or worse. He pulled his heavy cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around her, the fur-lined fabric still warm from his body heat. The gesture was intimate, protective, claiming, "You're under my protection now," he said, his voice dropping to something darker, more primal. "Mine." The possessiveness in his tone should have frightened her. Alpha claims were dangerous for Omegas. They could mean ownership, imprisonment, erasure of self. But instead of fear, something hot and fierce ignited in her chest, spreading through her veins like the poison that had failed to kill him. "Yours?" she whispered, and the word trembled with possibility. His arms came around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest, surrounding her with his strength and his scent and the undeniable reality of his presence. "If you'll have me, little wolf," he murmured against her hair. "Consequences be damned." She turned in his arms, tilting her face up to his, and saw her own defiance reflected in his eyes. They were both choosing this, choosing each other in full knowledge of the chaos it would unleash. Her mother had chosen survival through silence and complicity, but Celeste would choose something different. She would choose truth, even if it burned the world down. "Yes," she breathed, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted like rebellion and starlight and the beginning of war. Below them, the kingdom slept, unaware that their king had just claimed an Omega as his own, unaware that everything was about to change. And on the ramparts, wrapped in each other's arms, they didn't care. Let them come. Let the consequences fall where they may. Some things were worth fighting for. The council chamber was built to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings stretched 3 stories high, carved with the names of every alpha who'd ever ruled the 5 territories. The circular stone table could seat 50, and tonight, every seat was filled. Representatives from all 5 territories had answered the emergency summons, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. Celeste stood behind Lucian's chair, positioned where Omegas were always positioned, silent, invisible, present only to serve. But tonight, every eye in that chamber was fixed on her like she was a disease they couldn't afford to catch. Alpha Thorn rose first, his weathered face twisted with righteous fury. This emergency session has been called to address a crisis that threatens the very foundation of our society. His voice echoed off the stone. Our king has taken an Omega as his companion. He's launched an investigation that has destabilized trade agreements and territorial alliances. He's questioning bonds that have stood for decades, undermining the authority every alpha in this room holds over their own packs. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Celeste felt their hatred like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. The Omega, Thorn continued, not even using her name, has clearly manipulated His Majesty using whatever wiles her kind possess. It's the only explanation for this madness. King Lucian has always been a strong, rational leader, until she arrived. Alpha Sarah, from the Eastern Territories, stood next, her voice cold as winter. The investigation has already cost us 3 major trade agreements. Nobles who've held their positions for generations are being questioned like common criminals, all because one Omega made accusations she cannot possibly prove. I can prove them. Celeste's voice cut through the chamber, clear and unwavering. Silence crashed down. 50 pairs of eyes turned to her with expressions ranging from shock to murderous rage. Omegas did not speak in council chambers. Omegas did not interrupt Alphas. Lucian's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing once a silent message. Together. You will not address this council, Thorn snarled. You have no voice here, then I'll be her voice. Lucian rose to his full height, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Power radiated from him in waves that made every wolf in the chamber instinctively submit. Celeste has compiled documentation of 47 fraudulent bonds across our territories. Financial records linking Lord Marcus and Alpha Thorn to a trafficking network that's been selling Omegas to the highest bidder for nearly a decade. We have testimony from freed Omegas describing abuse that would make you sick if you cared enough to listen. He pulled out a leather folder, sliding it across the table. It's all here. Names, dates, transactions. The natural order you're so desperate to defend is built on slavery and exploitation. You can't possibly believe her, Alpha Garrett from the Southern Territories protested. She's an Omega. They're notorious liars, manipulators. She's clearly bewitched you. I've seen the evidence with my own eyes. Lucian's voice was deadly quiet now, more dangerous than any shout. I've read the testimonies. I've met the victims. This isn't manipulation, this is justice you've been avoiding because it's profitable not to look too closely. Thorn slammed his fist on the table. You've become unfit to lead, fraternizing with an Omega, destabilizing the territories, rejecting centuries of tradition. The council has no choice. He looked around at the assembled alphas, gathering support. We present you with an ultimatum, King Lucian. Either exile the Omega and abandon this investigation immediately, or face a vote of no confidence that will strip you of your title. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Celeste felt her heart stop. A vote of no confidence meant exile for Lucian, meant someone like Thorn would take the crown, meant everything they'd fought for would disappear, and the Omegas they'd freed would be returned to bondage. Please, she whispered, so quietly only Lucian could hear. Don't sacrifice everything for me. He turned to face her, his silver eyes blazing with something fierce and absolute. Then he turned back to the council, and his voice carried to every corner of that ancient chamber. No. The single word resonated like a thunderclap. The natural order you defend is built on the suffering of those too weak to fight back. I will not abandon this investigation. I will not abandon Celeste. I will not compromise with wolves who profit from the enslavement of their own kind. He stepped forward, and several alphas actually flinched. If you believe protecting my wolves from exploitation makes me unfit to lead, then challenge me for the crown. Here, now. Let's settle this the old way. The chamber fell into shocked silence. A challenge meant a fight to the death, alpha against alpha, the winner taking everything. No one moved. For all their bluster and threats, not one alpha in that room was willing to face Lucian in single combat. They'd seen what he could do, seen the bodies he'd left on battlefields. Voting him out was safe. Fighting him was suicide. I thought not. Lucian's smile was sharp as broken glass. This council is adjourned. You have 1 week to review the evidence. Then we reconvene, and you will vote on reforms, not on my fitness to lead. He took Celeste's hand and walked out of that chamber with his head high, leaving 50 stunned alphas in their wake. They'd barely made it to the corridor when Beta Gabriel appeared from the shadows, his expression grim. "My king, I need to speak with you." Privately, Lucian pulled them into an empty antechamber, door closing with an ominous click. "What is it?" Gabriel's eyes darted to Celeste, then back to Lucian. "There's been talk, my king." Overheard conversations between Thorn's guard and Marcus's former allies. "They won't challenge you fairly, they know they can't win." He hesitated, then forced the words out. "They're planning to assassinate her. They believe if Celeste dies, you'll have no reason to continue the investigation. That grief will make you abandon the reforms." Celeste's blood turned to ice. Lucian's hand tightened on hers until it almost hurt. "When?" His voice was absolutely calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Soon. Maybe tonight. They're desperate. And desperate wolves do foolish things." Lucian turned to Celeste, and she saw something dangerous kindle in his silver eyes, not anger, but cold, calculated fury. "Then we'll be ready for them," he said quietly. "And when they come, they'll learn exactly what happens to wolves who threaten what's mine. Not the pleasant wood smoke from the hearth fires that warmed the palace at night, but something sharper, thicker, wrong." Celeste's head snapped up from the treaty she'd been reviewing in her quarters, quill frozen mid-stroke. Smoke curled under her door like reaching fingers. Her wolf surged to alertness, instinct screaming danger before her mind caught up. She dropped the quill and lunged for the door, wrapping her hand in her sleeve before touching the handle. Heat radiated through the wood. When she cracked it open, flames roared in the corridor, a wall of fire spreading with unnatural speed, fed by something slick and shimmering on the stone floor. Oil. Someone had accelerated this. Celeste slammed the door shut, heart hammering against her ribs. Smoke already thickened the air in her room, stinging her eyes, scraping her throat. She ran to the window and shoved it open. Cold night air rushed in, but the courtyard yawned 3 stories below, cobblestones gleaming dully in the moonlight. A fall from this height would shatter bones even for a wolf. For an Omega, it meant death. Behind her, the doorframe began to char. Flames licked through the gaps, hungry and merciless. Heat pressed against her back like a hand shoving her toward the window. Smoke filled her lungs. Her vision swam. She was trapped. The door exploded inward in a shower of burning splinters. Through the smoke and fire, a shape hurtled into the room, too large to be fully human, too controlled to be fully beast. Lucian in half shift, his body stretched and reinforced with wolf strength. Claws extended from hands that were still recognizably his, eyes blazing pure molten gold. Fur rippled along his shoulders and arms. His teeth had lengthened to fangs. He looked terrifying. He looked magnificent. "Celeste!" His voice came rough, layered with growl. She couldn't speak, lungs too full of smoke. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, not slowing, and scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The impact of his body heat against hers, solid and impossibly alive, shocked a gasp from her. "Hold on," he commanded. Then he turned and leaped through the window. Her stomach dropped. Wind screamed past. For one weightless, impossible moment they fell through open air, the courtyard rushing up to meet them. She buried her face in his chest, certain they'd both die on the stones below. Lucian landed in a crouch that should have shattered bone. The impact jarred through her, but he absorbed it with inhuman grace, muscles coiling and releasing, claws scoring the cobblestones. He didn't stumble, didn't fall. He straightened smoothly, still holding her, and turned back toward the tower. Flames poured from her window now, orange and vicious against the night sky. Smoke billowed upward in a dark column. Shouts erupted across the courtyard as guards and servants scrambled toward the fire. "Are you hurt?" Lucian's voice rumbled through his chest, still rough with wolf. Celeste shook her head, coughing. "How did you—" "I felt your fear through the bond." His arms tightened fractionally around her, like a knife to the chest. Bond. The word hung between them, unspoken until now. They weren't bonded, not officially, not by ceremony, but something had formed anyway, invisible and undeniable. Gabriel appeared, breathless and soot-streaked. "Your Majesty." The fire was set deliberately. Oil on the corridor floors timed to spread fast. The night guards who should have been stationed there were found unconscious, drugged. Lucian's eyes flashed dangerously bright. And Marcus? Gone. His chambers are empty. Looks like he fled hours ago. A growl built in Lucian's chest, vibrating against Celeste's ribs. Lock down the palace. No one leaves. Search every room. Every passage. I want him found. Gabriel nodded sharply and sprinted away, barking orders. Lucian shifted her weight and started walking, not toward the guest quarters or the healer's wing, but toward the central tower. His tower. Where are we going? She asked hoarsely. My chambers. Lucian, I can't. You almost burned alive tonight because I left you vulnerable. His voice was flat, final. I won't make that mistake again. I can't protect you if you're scattered across the palace. Protocol would be shattered. The scandal would be immediate. An unmated Omega in the king's private rooms was an unthinkable breach. She didn't argue. His chambers were vast and austere, dark wood, thick rugs, a fireplace large enough to stand in. The bed dominated one wall, massive and draped in deep gray furs. A leather couch sat near the hearth. He set her down gently, human again except for the gold still burning in his eyes. You take the bed. I'll sleep there. He nodded toward the couch. You don't have to. I do. His jaw was set. For both our sakes. A servant brought water and clean clothes. Celeste washed the soot from her skin and changed into a soft linen shift that smelled of cedar, his scent. When she emerged, Lucian had banked the fire low and stretched out on the couch, still fully dressed, one arm thrown over his eyes. She climbed into his bed, hyper-aware of his presence across the room, of the way his scent wrapped around her like safety and temptation braided together. Sleep came fitfully. She woke in deep night to find him sitting on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, watching her with an expression that made her chest ache. Lucian, I'm terrified, he said, voice raw. That loving you will be what gets you killed. The confession cracked open the space between them. Celeste sat up slowly, heart pounding for entirely different reasons now. You love me? His laugh was bitter. How could I not? You're brilliant and brave, and you see me as a man, not a crown. But every moment you're near me, you're a target. Tonight proved that. I'm already a target, she whispered. Walking away won't change what I know or what I've done. It'll only mean facing it alone. His hands curled into fists. I should send you somewhere safe. Far from court. Do you want me to go? The question hung in the darkness. No. The word came out broken. God's help me, no. She slipped from the bed and crossed to him, bare feet silent on the rug. When she stood before him, he looked up at her like she was both salvation and damnation. Then stop protecting me from yourself, she said, and start letting me stand beside you. His hand came up, hovering near her face, trembling with restraint. If I touch you now, I won't be able to let go. She leaned into his palm, letting him cup her cheek. His skin was warm, calloused, impossibly gentle. Then don't, she breathed. His control shattered. He pulled her down into his lap, arms banding around her, and buried his face in her hair. She felt him shaking this powerful alpha king trembling against her like he'd almost lost something irreplaceable. I thought I was too late, he whispered against her throat. I thought I'd find you. You didn't. I'm here. She threaded her fingers through his hair. I'm safe. They stayed like that, wrapped around each other in the dying firelight, until exhaustion finally dragged them both under. When dawn broke, they were still tangled together on the couch, his arms locked around her, her head tucked beneath his chin. The palace would talk. Let them. The Grand Council chamber always felt too large, but that day it seemed built to swallow her whole. Celeste stood near the back beside Gabriel, the weight of 100 watching eyes like teeth on her skin. Alphas from all 5 territories filled the tiered benches, their scents thick and clashing iron, pine, ice, smoke. At the center, on the raised dais, Lucian sat in the king's chair, posture relaxed but coiled, as if he expected the room to lunge. It did. The great doors boomed open. Marcus strode in as if he'd never fled the palace, silver hair immaculate, expression cool. Beside him walked Alpha Thorn, broad-shouldered and brutal in black leathers, his thorn-crowned sigil gleaming at his throat. A dozen northern warriors followed like a wall of muscle and menace. Conversation died. Even the torches seemed to lean closer. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, bowing with precise disrespect. "You summoned the council to discuss alleged corruption. We bring clarity." He handed a leather folder to the nearest scribe, who carried it up to Lucian. Celeste's stomach knotted. She recognized the parchment inside before it was fully unfurled templates, ledgers, bond copies, but not hers. "These," Marcus announced, voice carrying easily, "are documents drafted in the hand of your current Omega advisor. They show a pattern of fraudulent clauses she constructed herself, later inserted into treaties to destabilize our territories." A ripple of shock moved through the chamber. Celeste went cold. The handwriting was close to hers, too close. Ink strokes mimicked her style, down to the way she crossed her T's. Forged. She then manufactured a tale of exploitation, Marcus continued smoothly, to frame honorable alphas like myself and Alpha Thorn, and to secure your personal protection. Eyes swung toward Celeste, curious, condemning, hungry for scandal. Lucian glanced over the documents once, then laughed. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. "You expect me to believe," he said, amusement curling his lip, "that the Omega who saved my pack from your trap is secretly your mastermind? That she forged your signature? Your seal? For 20 years before she was even born?" Murmurs. Several alphas shifted uncomfortably. Marcus's smile thinned. "You defend a fraud because you share her bed. Your judgment is compromised." Thorn stepped forward, voice a low rumble. "You dishonor every alpha here by parading an Omega in a place of power she was never meant to hold. You forget the natural order, Lucian." Lucian's eyes went wolf-dark. "The natural order you're so desperate to protect is slavery." Thorn's gaze slid to Celeste, lingering just long enough to make bile rise in her throat. "You defend this, experiment over your own kind. Then let the moon decide your fitness." His voice rose, filling the chamber. "Before the assembled council and under Luna's eye, I invoke the challenge right. You defend a fraud and insult all alphas. I challenge your right to rule." The room erupted. Growls, gasps, the scrape of boots on stone. Celeste's blood turned to ice. The challenge right. Lucian went utterly still. Pack law wrapped around his shoulders like iron. Refuse, and he abdicated. Accept, and one of them would die. Gabriel's hand closed around Celeste's wrist, steadying. "He can win," he murmured. "He's beaten Thorn before. In a skirmish," she whispered back. "Not under the moon with the council watching and my head on the block." Because that was the unspoken clause. If Lucian lost, if Thorn killed him, Celeste would be executed as collaborator and seductress, the convenient scapegoat to cauterize the kingdom's shame. Lucian rose slowly from the throne. Power rolled off him in measured waves, calming the room by force of will. 3 nights, he said. At the next full moon, in the ancient circle. I accept. The formal words sealed like a lock. Celeste's heart lurched. The palace changed overnight. Training yards echoed with the clash of steel and the thud of bodies hitting packed dirt. Lucian put himself through brutal drills until sweat darkened his shirt, and even his betas begged him to rest. Northern warriors prowled the corridors like wolves scenting blood. Servants moved in hushed, frantic currents. The air itself felt sharpened. Celeste had no time to be afraid. If Lucian was preparing his body, she would prepare their proof. The forged documents Marcus had produced were clever, but she knew the real pattern better than anyone. Somewhere, there had to be an original one-master treaty from which all the poisoned clauses had been copied. Her father had mentioned it once, weeks before the mines took his strength. Asterisk. They keep the real spell in the king's vault, Starling. The rest are just echoes. Asterisk. The sacred vault. Only the reigning king and his high counselor could access it, unless the king's beta had a very good memory for security rotations. The night before the full moon, the palace lay under a nervous hush. Celeste paced the edge of Lucian's study, watching him wrap his hands with leather before another late training session. You should be sleeping, she said. So should you? Her heart battered against her ribs. I think I know where the original treaty is. He paused, attention snapping fully to her. Where? The sacred vault, where the old kings kept their most dangerous bonds. My father heard Marcus brag about it once. Gabriel, standing by the doorway, swore under his breath. We'd need dual access. the king and the high counselor. Or, Celeste said, voice low, one king and one very good forger of signatures. Lucian's brow furrowed. She met his gaze steadily. I've copied your hand 100 times this month, she said. Your seal too. I can get us in if you're willing to bend a law that exists to protect lies. A beat of silence. Then his mouth curved, sharp and proud. Gabriel, you're with us, he said. Anyone asks, we're praying before the rite. The path to the vault lay beneath the oldest part of the palace, down spiraling stone steps slick with age, torches guttered in narrow sconces, shadows swallowing the corners. The thick door at the bottom bore the royal sigil in iron. Celeste's fingers didn't tremble as much as she expected when she pressed Lucian's signet into the wax of the access scroll and traced his name in looping script. The wards hummed, evaluating, then flickered open with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the vault smelled of old magic and trapped dust. Shelves lined the walls, each containing a small number of meticulously labeled scrolls. Not many. Only the truly dangerous things were kept here. Celeste moved straight to the section marked Time's Founding Accords *. Her father's words echoed in her head. She scanned titles, fingers skimming over vellum until one label snagged her breath. * Territorial Consolidation and Resource Optimization, Master Template. * There. Her voice shook. That has to be it. Lucian lifted the scroll with reverent care and laid it on the central table. Together they unrolled it. The clauses stared back at them like a familiar nightmare, every poisoned phrase woven into a single elegant document. At the bottom, 2 signatures in dark, age-stained ink. High Counselor Marcus Valen, Alpha Thorn of the Northern Territories. It's everything, Celeste whispered. Intent, pattern, their hands. 20 years ago. Lucian's jaw clenched. This ends them. Gabriel handed her the small camera he'd procured from the human traders, its metal cold against her palm. Quickly, he urged. If we're caught here. She snapped images of each section, heart pounding, careful not to let the device's faint click echo too loudly. The air shifted. A new scent curled through the vault entrance, cold metal, bitter herbs, and satisfaction. Clever little Omega, Marcus said from the doorway. Too clever for your own good. The ancient stone circle stood on the highest hill beyond the palace walls, each weathered pillar reaching toward the moon like petrified fingers. Hundreds of wolves crowded the terraced slopes, alphas, betas, even a scattering of omegas pressed into the farthest edges. Their collective scent was a stifling wall. Anticipation, bloodlust, judgment. Celeste stood locked in the witness cage, iron bars biting cold against her palms. Marcus stood just outside, arms crossed, expression carved from ice. He hadn't spoken since the guards dragged her here at moonrise, but his presence was threat enough. At the circle's center, under the swollen moon, Lucian and Thorn circled each other. Both had shifted halfway, bodies stretched and reinforced with wolf strength, claws extended, eyes burning gold and amber respectively. Thorn was massive, his half-form a monument of muscle and aggression, fur bristling along shoulders thick as tree trunks. Lucian moved with coiled grace, leaner but faster, power radiating in controlled waves. The Rite Master, an ancient beta draped in ceremonial furs, raised his staff. By moon and blood, let this challenge be witnessed. To the death or submission. Begin. Thorn lunged first. The impact when they collided shook the ground. Claws met flesh with sickening efficiency. Lucian twisted, using Thorn's momentum against him, raking his side as the larger alpha stumbled past. Blood scattered dark across pale stone. Thorn roared and spun, faster than something his size should move. His fist, half hand, half paw, caught Lucian across the jaw. The crack echoed. Lucian hit the ground and rolled, coming up in a crouch, crimson already dripping from a split cheek. They clashed again, a blur of violence and primal fury. Claws carved through muscle, teeth snapped inches from throats. The watching crowd howled and snarled, swept up in the ancient rhythm of dominance and survival. Celeste couldn't breathe. Every blow Lucian took felt like it landed on her own skin. She gripped the bars until her knuckles went white. Thorn was relentless, pressing his size advantage, driving Lucian back step by brutal step. A vicious swipe opened 3 deep gashes across Lucian's ribs. Another tore his shoulder. He was faster, yes, but Thorn only needed to land 1 killing strike. It came when Lucian's foot slipped on blood-slick stone. Thorn's claws sank into his side, lifting and slamming him down with bone-shaking force. Lucian hit the ground hard, breath punching out of him. Thorn loomed over him, fangs bared in a grotesque smile. "The Omega watches you die," Thorn growled. "Then I take her apart slowly." Lucian surged up, claws aiming for the throat, but Thorn batted him aside like a pup. Lucian crashed into one of the standing stones and crumpled, gasping, blood pooling beneath him. He tried to rise, fell to one knee. No. The words screamed through Celeste's mind, through her wolf, through every fiber of her being. She couldn't watch this, couldn't stand here caged while the man she loved bled out on stone. Her wolf surged to the surface for the first time in years. The shift hurt bones realigning, muscles compacting. Omega wolves were small, built for speed and stealth, not combat. She dropped to all fours, russet fur bristling, and did the one thing every instinct told her not to do. She bit Marcus. Her jaws closed on his forearm before he could react. He bellowed, stumbling back, and she squeezed through the gap between cage bars her smaller frame could manage. The iron scraped her sides, but she pushed through, hitting the ground running. Gabriel had hidden the evidence near the council's platform, wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose stone. She shifted back mid-stride, ignoring her nakedness, and grabbed the bundle with shaking hands. "The truth!" she screamed, her voice raw and ringing across the sudden shocked silence. She sprinted toward the raised platform where the 5 territorial leaders sat. The Master Treaty. Marcus and Thorn created the fraudulent bonds together 20 years ago. She hurled the documents at their feet. Parchment scattered across stone, ancient ink visible even in moonlight. Chaos erupted. Marcus lunged for her, rage twisting his features, but Gabriel came out of nowhere and tackled him to the ground. They rolled in a snarling tangle of limbs. The council leader, an iron-haired alpha named Saren, snatched up the nearest page. Her eyes widened. "These signatures." "Lies!" Thorn roared, but he wasn't looking at the council. He was looking at Celeste, standing exposed and defiant in the center of the circle. His eyes promised murder. He lunged, not at Lucian, but at her, the Omega who had ruined everything. Celeste froze, wolf and human both screaming that she couldn't outrun an alpha in full fury. Thorn's claws reached for her throat, close enough she could smell the copper tang of Lucian's blood on them. Then a shadow intercepted. Lucian slammed into Thorn mid-leap with the last reserve of his strength, the full weight of his wolf behind it. They hit the ground in an explosion of dust and violence. Lucian's claws found purchase in Thorn's chest and drove deep, sinking between ribs, piercing through muscle and bone to the frantically beating heart beneath. Thorn's roar cut off into a wet, choking gasp. Lucian leaned close, voice a guttural rasp. "You don't touch her. Ever." He twisted his claws and pulled. Thorn collapsed, eyes going glassy, the light fading from them like a snuffed candle. His body hit the stone with a heavy final thud. The circle fell deathly silent. Lucian swayed, still half-shifted, blood streaming from a dozen wounds. His gaze found Celeste across the space between them, and something in his expression cracked relief, anguish, love too fierce to contain. He took one step toward her and fell. Celeste caught him before he hit the ground, her small frame buckling under his weight but refusing to let him fall. "I've got you," she sobbed. "I've got you." Healers rushed forward. Guards seized Marcus, wrenching him away from Gabriel and forcing him to his knees in silver-lined chains. The council leaders descended on the scattered documents, passing them between one another with increasingly grim expressions. Saren's voice rang out, cold and absolute. "This evidence is genuine. The signatures match archival records. High Counselor Marcus and Alpha Thorn orchestrated systematic fraud spanning 2 decades. She turned to Marcus, contempt radiating from every line of her body. "You are stripped of rank and title. You will face trial for treason, conspiracy, and the enslavement of pack members." Marcus said nothing, his expression a mask of barely contained fury. Lucian's eyes fluttered open, still gold bright, but fading toward human brown. His hand came up to cup Celeste's cheek, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You broke out of a cage," he rasped, the corner of his mouth lifting. "For documents. For you," she whispered fiercely. "Always for you." Around them, the gathered wolves began to howl not in bloodlust now, but in recognition. The challenge had been met. The king had defended his claim. The truth had been laid bare under the moon's unforgiving eye. Lucian pulled her down until her forehead rested against his, their breaths mingling, hearts beating in desperate rhythm. "I love you," he said, loud enough for the entire circle to hear. "Omega, advisor, the bravest wolf I've ever known, I love you." The healers tried to pull them apart to treat his wounds. Celeste snarled at them, a small Omega sound that should have been laughable but came out feral enough to make them pause. "Treat him here," she commanded. "I'm not letting go." Lucian's laugh was pained but genuine. "She's not letting go," he echoed. So they worked around her, stitching and binding while she held him, her hands in his hair, his blood soaking into her skin. The moon watched from above, full and pitiless and bright. And for the first time in 20 years, the truth was finally, irrevocably free. Marcus confessed 3 days after the challenge, his voice flat and stripped of its usual polish. The council chamber was packed, every territorial leader present, as he recited 2 decades of carefully orchestrated theft. Thorn had survived his wounds but sat in silver chains, title and lands already seized, watching his empire crumble with dead eyes. 47 bonds, Marcus said, each one designed to funnel Omega labor and resources to the northern territories. The profits were split evenly between us. When asked why, his answer was simple and damning. Because no one cared about Omegas. They were invisible, easy targets. Celeste stood at the back of the chamber, Lucian's hand steady at the small of her back, and felt something inside her finally settle. Her father's name would be cleared. The wolves who had suffered would be freed. Justice, at last. The council moved swiftly. All 47 fraudulent bonds were dissolved by emergency decree. Families torn apart were reunited. Omegas who had spent years in forced labor returned home to find their properties restored, compensation paid for Marcus and Thorn's seized assets. But the most radical change came in the new legislation Lucian proposed, and the council, under pressure from their own outraged packs, passed unanimously. Omegas could own property, refuse bonds, hold positions of authority, serve on councils. Their designation no longer defined their worth. The old hierarchy shuddered and began to crack. 1 week later, Lucian appeared before the Grand Council with Celeste at his right hand, not behind him but beside him, wearing the deep blue robes of the Royal Chancellor. "I intend to bond with Celeste Kennedy," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "And to make her my queen." The protests came immediately, a wave of shock and outrage from the more traditional alphas. "The bonding sickness will kill you both," Alpha Saren said, not unkindly. "Ancient law is clear. Alphas bond with alphas to produce strong heirs. An alpha-omega bond at your power level will trigger rejection. Your bodies will destroy each other." Lucian's expression didn't waver. "Then we die together." Celeste's heart clenched, but she kept her face calm. They had discussed this, planned for it, accepted the risk. "But I believe," Lucian continued, voice rising, "that the bonding sickness is a lie. Another tool to maintain a hierarchy built on fear and control. We intend to prove it." The chamber erupted. Half the council shouted support, the other half condemnation. Lucian waited for silence with the patience of stone. "If we survive," he said quietly, "the old laws die with the lie. If we don't, you'll have your proof that some traditions exist for a reason." The bonding ceremony took place under the next full moon, in the same stone circle where Lucian had defeated Thorn. Hundreds gathered to witness some hopeful, others certain they were watching a dual suicide. Celeste wore white, her blonde hair woven with silver thread. Lucian wore the ceremonial armor of his ancestors, the royal sigil gleaming at his chest. They knelt facing each other, hands clasped, while the Rite Master recited the ancient words. When the moment came to seal the bond, Lucian's claws extended, and he drew a careful line across his palm. Celeste did the same. Their blood mingled, and the bond snapped into place with a force that stole the breath from both their lungs. Power surged between them, Alpha and Omega, fire and water, two halves that shouldn't fit but did, perfectly and completely. The crowd waited for the bonding sickness to strike, for convulsions, for screaming, for the violent rejection that legend promised. Instead, Celeste felt only warmth spreading through her chest, Lucian's presence settling into her mind like he'd always belonged there. He felt it too. She could see it in his eyes, gold bleeding into brown, wonder replacing fear. They had survived. The gathered wolves erupted into howls that shook the stars. 5 years later, Celeste stood in the palace gardens, reviewing legislation with her Council 3 alphas, 2 betas, and 2 omegas, the new balance of power. Across the lawn, Lucian knelt in the grass while their twins climbed over him like he was a mountain put there for their amusement. Aria, their alpha daughter, had her father's dark hair and her mother's fierce determination. She was currently trying to pin his arm behind his back with limited success. Kieran, their omega son, sat on Lucian's shoulders, blonde curls wild, laughing as his father pretended to collapse under his immense weight. Celeste's heart swelled watching them. The kingdom had transformed in half a decade. Omega representatives sat on every territorial council. Mixed bonds were celebrated rather than condemned. The old hierarchy hadn't disappeared entirely. Change was slow, but it was crumbling, piece by piece. She felt Lucian's attention shift to her across the garden. Their eyes met, and his voice slid warm through their bond. Asterisk. You changed everything, little wolf. Asterisk. Ah, she smiled, letting her love flow back through the connection. Asterisk. We changed everything. Together. Asterisk. Arya finally succeeded in toppling Lucian into the grass. Kieran shrieked with delight and launched himself on top of both of them. Celeste set down her documents and crossed the lawn to join her family, the late afternoon sun warm on her face, the future bright and unwritten before them. She was no longer invisible. She was queen, mother, revolutionary, and she was exactly where she belonged. Thank you so much for joining me on Celeste and Lucian's journey from that first dangerous moment in the stone hall to their hard-won happily ever after. If this story of forbidden love, shattered hierarchies, and wolves who dared to rewrite destiny resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your favorite moment was. Was it Celeste's brave interruption, the fire rescue, or that final bonding ceremony that proved love was stronger than ancient lies? Your support helps me bring you more dark romance, fierce heroines, and alpha kings who learn that true strength means protecting, not dominating. Until next time, my fierce hearts, keep howling at your own moons.